are you more of a super productive kind of person in your week, or are you more of a super procrastinator? It's not binary, it's a scale. So what to think about, are you like uber productive, you're really like, you know, very driven with your lists, or are you a bit like, oh, you just do 101 other things than the thing that I really should be doing? The way that we are going to work out is the stars. People know this already. The people that are new, if you go towards the top of your screen, you can see view options, and then annotate, and then stamp, and you'll find these lovely star stamps that people are putting on this scale here. So you're going to go to view options, annotate, stamp, put the stamp on this scale where you are. There's someone with a heart who's like, I am full on super productive. I love that. Full on super productive. Oh, what a spread of efficiency we have on this call today. The super procrastinators. Oh. There's no shame. It's you know, A, it's anonymous, and B, will help you through it. Okay, I have another question for you. So I'm gonna clear down your stars. Someone's just going mad with the pink pen. Let's clear down those. My second question for you is particularly for those people who have a tendency to procrastinate, whether you're a bit of a procrastinator or a self-identified super procrastinator. Which one of these feels more like the reason that you procrastinate? So do you procrastinate because work sometimes just feels really hard and other stuff's easier? Is it when you're really overwhelmed? Is it because sometimes your work that you do maybe lacks meaning? Is it because the work just lacks clarity, so you can't maybe prioritize? Maybe you want to be perfect and that fear of it not being perfect gets in your way, or is it something else? And if it is something else, that'd be great to see that in chat so we can make sure we know what's going on. Okay. Interesting. Very pretty as well, but also interesting. What do you think, Sarah? What are the main ones there? Want it to be perfect? Sorry, you go.
I suppose it just shows that it's not one size fits all. Because actually often we do these kind of exercises and you do get a bit of you can see a kind of trend or a theme emerging. But I think, and some things I'm going to talk about with procrastination, I think it is quite personal, probably a bit depending on the type of work that you do, but also the type of person that you are.
I was just looking, when there's not a clear goal. Yeah, I agree. Paralysis, you don't know where to invest your time when there isn't a deadline. I didn't put this in the podcast that way, but sometimes I like self-create deadlines. So when Sarah and I went to university together, she'll laugh at this, I don't even know if she knows this, but I used to set myself like fake deadlines. So like a week in advance of the actual deadline that something had to be in, I'd set that as my real deadline, so that when everyone else was like panicking, I'm not very good at panic. When everyone else was panicking, I'd be like, oh, I'm just gonna go do something else now while you all have this moment of panic. So in a nutshell then, episode 155, we talk a little bit about some of the reasons why people procrastinate, which we've like looked at now. And then we also looked at a few tips to help people to overcome procrastination. And I think you really have to work out what works for you, and also work out what's maybe right for you at different moments. So just because one thing might work for you right now doesn't mean it will always do. So here are just a few that we talk about. I'm just going to reference them quickly, both as a reminder and for some people that might not have been on there. So the first thing was plants. Loved this one. University of Exeter did a study and they found that people who have plants are surrounded by a lean and green environment, which is not a diet. So I don't think it's surrounding yourself with lettuce, it's actually plants, are 15% more kind of efficient in their day. So maybe if you like a bit of greenery, that's probably an easy boost. There's this one, this is the Pomodoro Technique. It's basically timing your work into sections of 25 minutes. So you time your work, set yourself a section, and then you give yourself a 5-minute break, and you basically build up these what's called Pomodoros, these 25-minute sections of work, and it just helps you to focus. So maybe if you're one of those people who struggle to focus on the work, Pomodoro might be a way of you sort of chunking your work up to be more efficient. This one is one of mine. It's the golden hour. Like this, everybody. The golden hour. It's basically acknowledging that somewhere in your day there's probably an hour where you're more efficient, where you are most efficient, and that looks different for different people. So for example, for me, like early doors, 7:30 to 8:30, if I can get my husband to like do breakfast and get the kids ready, that is amazing for me. I'm way more productive. Sarah's probably more later in the evening. Her brain just seems to be better then, which makes for interesting WhatsApp messages to each other when we're both on alert at different stages. This one down here is another one from me. I think clean slate works great. So if I'm ever kind of feel like I'm procrastinating, sometimes the easiest thing for me is just to stop seeing all the work noise. So all the 101 things that I need to do and my busy inbox, that's a very appealing thing for me to procrastinate in sometimes. But clean slate works great for me. So what are just 3 things that I need to get done? And that means I can get through it. Some of you probably heard this one. It's about eating the frog, lovely Mark Twain quote that we talk about on the podcast. But it's this one is all about just basically get the hard stuff done first. If you tend to procrastinate, just work out what the biggest thing that you might be avoiding is and get it done first. It means you've at least done something that you're proud of that day, but also it creates a sense of achievement and momentum for the rest of the day. So eat the frog. And last not least, it's this one here, which is monk mode. It's something that Sarah talked about with Bruce Daisley on the Joy of Work podcast that we did with him quite a while ago now. I can't actually remember what number it was, but Bruce is brilliant, and he talks about this concept of monk mode, which sometimes Sarah and I will say to each other, we're going to go dark. Like if we're going to do any book writing or anything that we really need to deeply invest our mental energy in, we'll say to each other, we're going to go into monk mode or we're going to go dark. And it basically means I'm not going to be available for you to distract me or get support on. I'm taking these 3-4 hours out to really deeply focus. And that can be, I think it's about an intention you set yourself, but it's also about an awareness that you create for other people that you are in that mode. So you're not really inviting distractions in. So that's just a couple of them. We go through, I think, about 10 different ideas for procrastination, overcoming it on the podcast. That's just a couple of the ones that have worked for both of us in the past. So I am going to hand over to Sarah now, and she's going to talk through some more practical things for you on procrastination. So I'll stop sharing, Sarah.
Thank you. Can you just make me co-host, please?
I can. Just give me a second and I'll get on with that.
I feel like you do this as to take the control away from me.
It's not that. I make our other Sarah co-host.
Yeah, I know. That's what I mean.
There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, you say you don't do it on purpose, but it keeps happening.
Well, remind me before we start, and it'll be less of an issue.
Right, here we go. So, this is where I'm so glad we do Pod Plus, because when we were preparing for the procrastination podcast, I thought, I was like, there's something we're missing. I know I've read something that's really helpful on this, and I just couldn't get it to kind of the top of my brain. And luckily, I've now remembered it. So you're going to get to hear the stuff that some of this definitely should have gone in the podcast if I had remembered it in time, because I do think his work on procrastination is probably some of the most kind of thoughtful and kind of well thought through. Some of you might know it. It's a guy called Stephen Pressfield, and he wrote a book called The War of Art. So not the art of war, but the War of Art, which I always get confused kind of saying that the right way around. But what he is, I think, particularly interesting for is where you're procrastinating on things that are quite big. So big projects, big ideas, things that you want to do that you're just not making progress against. So I think we've talked about quite a lot of tactics in your day, tactics in your moment that are good for kind of everyday work. I think he kind of comes at it more from what's stopping you? How are you kind of getting in your own way? And his kind of big idea is, and I kind of like it because it feels like it really is consistent with kind of how we talk about squiggly careers, is, we should always kind of be work in progress versus the things that kind of really matter to us. So I kind of like the work in progress language. But what gets in the way, and he uses, this is kind of his big thought, or his kind of big word, I guess, is this idea of resistance. And there are some brilliant links that I'm going to share. I'll put it on Amazing If Learning straight after this session. Interviews that he's done with Oprah and with people like Marie Forleo, where he does talk in quite a lot of detail about some of his thinking and his ideas. So I'm really going to summarise the 3 kind of main causes of resistance that exist, and then kind of 4 things that can help. And then if you really want more detail, there's lots of good stuff to kind of be found in this area. But let's talk about what do we mean when we kind of talk about this idea of resistance, bearing in mind kind of this thing around, it's almost like the hard thing about hard things, if that makes sense. So things that are hard, we know they're hard, and I think we're probably even more likely to procrastinate when something is quite tough. And this really is his premise about, it's not about really talent. So often we can tell ourselves, perhaps in quite a fixed mindset mode way. Oh, we're just not good enough at this, and perhaps I'm just not as gifted as the person kind of next to me. And he sort of says, well, that almost like might be true. There might be someone who is maybe they have got a higher IQ than you. Perhaps they are naturally a better writer than you. Perhaps they are naturally more creative than you. Who knows? We all kind of have kind of different natural talents. We kind of talk about with your strengths, you all have different natural talents. And that's kind of our starting point. I think that's really kind of the critical kind of phrase there is, it's where you start from. And then he sort of says, actually, there's a load of stuff that you can control. It's about your motivation, your discipline, how you think about yourself, and the kind of habits that you have. And it's about how hard and how smart we work. So personally, I find this really appealing because I think, okay, well, this is all stuff that I can control, that I can kind of do practical things to help make progress against those big goals or big objectives that we might have. What I would say is it doesn't mean it's easy. And when we talk about some of the actions, it doesn't then go, oh, well, here's the 10 checklists and you'll be fine. It's hard for a reason. But I think it's almost reassuring to frame it in this way of going, okay, but these are all things that we can do. He is actually a bit in the camp, which is in some ways quite anti-self-help, which I quite like, in that he's quite like, there's no excuses. That like this is kind of, it is up to you here, and this stuff is all very readily available. So actually, it's you choosing whether you want to kind of do it or not. So it's quite, in some ways, it's quite refreshing, and he's quite an interesting guy actually. If you like start watching his interviews. So there are three things, three I guess sources of resistance, and it's interesting. I'll perhaps ask you in a minute which of the three you think is most likely to get in your way, and it's different for all of us. So the first one is about getting started. And it's, for some of us, that's the kind of the challenge, is it's actually even moving here. It's like getting to the point of not doing something, to thinking about it, to actually taking action. And actually what the phrase here is, it might not work. So the kind of worry and the fear in our head stops us even getting started. This is where I think lots of people have, like you might have a business idea that you actually would really like to do, or you'd really like to test out, and we just don't quite get started. Or perhaps you have a project you'd like to get underway, or a hobby, or it could be something personal, I guess, as well, kind of personal things you'd like to do. But this kind of fear of what might happen just means that you just don't ever even get to the start point. So this is even getting to the start line. So that's the first kind of aspect of resistance. And some of these you'll struggle with, I guess, more than others. The second one is you've started and you're making progress climbing up this hill. There's kind of the top of the hill. But the top still feels like a really long way off. So you have got started, but you're perhaps 50% of the way there. And it's kind of going, this feels really tough. And this is where you get into self-sabotage. I'm not going to spell that right, sabotage. Self-sabotage. And this is where you sort of start to kind of go, I'm not going to make it. And we give up, which I know sounds like really negative language, but we do. We sometimes just think, this is just, I have made a start, this is just too hard, or it's not going to plan. Where I was hoping to get to feels like such a long way away. It's easier to stop than it is to keep going. And when I kind of talk about, I'm going to give some examples of these. And it's not hard to think of things where this happens, actually, that you kind of did get started. And perhaps at the start, it's quite exciting. There's quite a lot of energy at the start, and often quite a lot of positive momentum because there's a newness to it. And at this point, you start to get into it's just really hard work. And so at that point, kind of there's a real tendency to think, maybe I'll just stop. And then the last one, and I was asking my partner this morning which one he felt would hold him back, and this was definitely his. Straight away he said, this is actually, you've done the work but you don't want to put it out into the world. This is my excellent world for everybody. And this is the kind of real fear of okay, so what are other people going to think? So how are people going to respond to the work that I do? Is it good enough? And that's the whole, people talk about like done versus good enough. My partner, who's an accountant, he was like, oh, I sort of have done it, but there's always like, there's always one more mistake to find, or there's always one bit to make a bit better. And you can get to the point where,
That's such an interesting framing, isn't it? There's always one more mistake to find.
yeah, I mean, I think that is actually, I hear him talk about it, so I think that is actually how it works sometimes with the work that he does. And so he said, oh, there's a real tendency sometimes to not share something because a lot of his work gets reviewed, and so they do find mistakes. And so especially I think if you're in that kind of environment where it's always like improving and reviewing, you go, well, what point do I start to share? And there's an example that Stephen Pressfield gives in his work of one of his friends who'd actually written a book. So he'd written the book he wanted to write, and he just couldn't bring himself to share it because it was so personal to him, and he was so attached to him. He couldn't let it go because he was almost kind of too fearful of what the response might be. So just before we get onto the actions, which of those three is most likely to get in your way, or which is the biggest force of resistance? That's kind of the phrase that he used. Which is the biggest force of resistance for you? So perhaps just annotate on there, and let's see if we've got a real mix or whether there's a kind of trend, or feel free to put it in chat if it's easier. Helen, which is the one for you?
Oh, that middle one. I was having a nice chat with Maria about that. Like I get really excited, and then I'm a bit like, sort of, yeah.
A bit bored now.
Yeah. Yeah. Sound familiar? What about you?
I was trying to think. Definitely not getting started because I love new stuff.
Yeah.
That's like the least of my problems because that's one of my strengths. I think probably the third one.
I think the third one for you.
I think the third one. And when I'll give an example of something in a minute. I think I can keep working on stuff for quite a long time.
And actually, Sally obviously haven't got the annotations working, but they're both saying number one.
Okay. So again, a real mix, like people kind of saying quite different things, which I think just shows kind of how personal this is based on our kind of own experiences. So I just want to go through 4 ideas. So there's a lot of work there's a lot you can read, watch and listen to in terms of ideas, into things you can do. And he goes into there's lots of kind of details. But it is actually all very accessible. I would say the books and the content is very accessible, but I've picked 4 things that I thought kind of might be helpful, which hopefully will play to each of those kind of 3. The first, and he talks about this a lot, is actually the value of both routines and rituals. So this is about, it's kind of, it definitely, if this is the one for you, it definitely would be worth looking at James Clear's work on atomic habits. So a lot of this is about habits. He talks about, Stephen Pressfield talks quite a lot about sitting down and like showing up. Almost at this point, the quality of the output is less important than the doing. It's like, you've just got to sit down and like do it. Because it does come, there's a slight creative skew to some of the stuff that he talks about, but it does apply, I think, to whatever work you do. And he was like, well, if you need to sit down and write something, you've got to sit down, you've got to open up that Word document, you've got to start writing. And he sort of worries less about, will you get to a good point? Because actually just by doing it, you will get there. He actually is a kind of, he's a believer in like the muse idea, the idea of like, if you just have the right routines and rituals, kind of the right things will happen. It's almost like the world looks favourably on you.
Very Liz Gilbert in Big Magic.
Yeah, it is actually. Which, given he's quite a kind of practical guy, is actually quite interesting that he kind of subscribes to this idea. So this really is about like, he's got a manifesto actually called like doing the work. So it is about just kind of making sure that we talked a bit about this in the podcast this week, have you created the right environment, the right habits, the right time to actually this is, I think, kind of the getting started point. And it's so easy to not. It's always easier to look at an email. It's always easier to, actually, the times where I do find it harder to start things, I know I'm procrastinating because I tidy up. And so I tidy to stop me starting. And actually, I'm not someone who needs to work in a particularly tidy space. Like if my camera was to scroll around, I have bits of paper everywhere. I kind of work in quite a creative way. So I know if I get overly tidying uppy, it's because it's getting in the way of me sitting down and kind of showing up. So I think if you're struggling with the very start one, habits, just figuring out what does it look like to just start. Even if you were to go, I'm just going to spend an hour on it next Wednesday at midday, that's better than not doing it, essentially. And the second one, which is really important, I think, is around not taking it personally. So I think this is for the people who struggle perhaps on the route to getting to kind of that top point. So I thought I would just give you an example here, and this is around how people respond to the work that you do, because often you're quite attached to things. This is a couple of screenshots of the very first version of the book that became The Squiggly Career. So this is, I actually can't remember the date, but it would have been, not, this is when I took the picture today, but this would have been 5 years ago, Helen?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, ish.
I can't remember.
5 years ago, where we wrote a book that no one was interested in, nobody wanted to read, but we wrote it anyway. Now, what's really interesting about that is we actually took that book, a written version of that book, to an agent who sort of said they were really interested, and then they weren't really interested. We took it to some publishers. We had kind of people responding to us and going, like, thanks, but no thanks. And at that point, when we talk about kind of self-sabotage and kind of giving up, it would have been really easy to take that personally, to go, okay, well, we're not good writers. These are not good ideas. This is not the right thing to do. I'm going to stop. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't kind of persevere regardless. I don't think that's kind of what he's trying to say. I think what he's trying to say is going, okay, well, if you get that kind of feedback, if it's something that's really important to you, you've got to kind of choose to persevere with it. And you've got to either do it for your own purposes, you've got to do it for your own kind of gratification, rather than looking for external gratification, or you might come back to it and choose to do it in another way. So actually what happened with us is we ended up self-publishing a kind of much smaller book called How to Overcome Your Confidence Gremlins. And it's just a really small illustrated book, but we did it very much for our own, I think, development, because we wanted to practice, I think, getting our ideas out there. And that was us continuing up that hill, but in a different way, but you were still making progress. So it's kind of that having the flexibility and the adaptability to, I think you still need to listen and kind of understand what other people are saying, but that actually if something is important to you, still making progress, kind of regardless actually of what other people think. And these things can be quite precious to us, so it's really easy to take them personally. So there's a rubbish version of our kind of early book for you. This is an interesting one. So it's about don't over-identify with your job. So often with these things that are really important to us, we hold on to them really tight. And he kind of talks about, don't forget, for every project, there's basically, you're building up to the next one that will be even better than the one that you're working on today. These are just a couple of examples of projects that I worked on that I put my heart and soul into, but I always kind of knew there was going to be something else. There was always going to be kind of the next thing. And both of these things, so these are, you could actually still Google both of these projects. Both of these projects got killed, and I was responsible for both of them, which implies I've not got a good track record, but at the time they were good. So the left, Ben Shepherd and Lisa Faulkner, who you can see there, did a TV programme for Sainsbury's that I created, and Waste Less Save More was a food waste project I also worked on for Sainsbury's. And both of those things really mattered to me, and I needed to make progress, and they were hard, big, kind of long projects. But the point is going, but when that thing happens, when it becomes kind of real, you've got to at some point recognize it's okay to kind of let it go and move on to the next thing. I think it's seeing everything as, oh, I'm learning and getting better, I'm being kind of work in progress. So the first thing that you do is not going to be the last thing that you do. And I can think of times where perhaps you do get too close. The point he's trying to make here is you are not your job. And it's really important to kind of recognize that and have just a bit of space around the edges to figure out that if things don't go to plan, as we kind of talked about, it's okay, because there'll always be another project. And his point is you'll just get that bit better the next time. And then the final point, which was not an excuse just to have a massive picture of a tortoise, but it did make me smile on a Thursday morning, is hard things take time. And I know it's a cliche, this point around there's no such thing as overnight success. But actually, when Marie Forleo was talking to Stephen Pressfield in this interview that she did, you know, she was talking about her own journey and saying how so many people say to her, oh, you've just sort of appeared as this self-help guru, self-styled guru, I guess. And she is very kind of stylish, and she just looks so put together, and I think people are like, wow, you're amazing. People definitely say things like that because it's quite an American vibe. But I would persevere with just get past the first 3 minutes of her introduction if you don't love the American vibe, and then it's really good content. And she talks about, this has been 20 years in the making. And this is really the point, I think, of Angela Duckworth's work on grit, around sticking with things, that hard things do take time, and that we have to be patient. There's quite a lot of points that he makes around patience, persevering, coming back to things that really matter to you. And even he's had some incredibly best-selling books in kind of the New York Times. And he was talking about even his latest book took 3 years. And you're like, oh, that's really interesting. You'd thought someone like that could just churn them out, would get lots of people just saying yes to them very quickly. And he was like, oh, no, people weren't really interested. Perhaps he didn't time it right. But he was just going, you've got to understand that kind of you're in it for the long term and got to play the long game, but you've got to keep making progress as you go. So that doesn't mean just kind of sitting and waiting. We sometimes talk about the importance of create, don't wait. And I think that helps to kind of distill and sum up a lot of what he says. So there's loads of links for this week. There's a couple of really good videos that I watched with Stephen Pressfield talking, and then there's some really good blogs that summarize a lot of his tips if you kind of don't want to read his books. But his books are short, they're quite easy to read. And I think if you particularly identify with being a procrastinator on big projects, I would say the War of Art is everyone I know who's read that has always said to me, oh, amazing, really kind of life-changing, and you'll see it gets incredible reviews.
So conscious